Hey friends, welcome back to Better on Purpose. Before we jump into today's conversation, I just want to take a moment and say thank you. Over the last few weeks, I've received so many messages, positive comments, and had multiple conversations with people who shared that something from the first few episodes has resonated with them. And I don't take that lightly because honestly, starting this podcast felt both exciting and a little uncomfortable. I've had a lot of moments where I wondered if these conversations would connect with anyone besides me. I wondered if people would find value in them. I wondered if it made sense to spend time creating something like this when there are already so many voices and perspectives in the world, specifically in the podcast space, as many others now have podcasts as well. But one thing I've been reminded of lately is that sometimes we don't need certainty before we begin. I've always kind of operated from the opposite mindset, but lately I've been striving to lean into the uncertainty and push myself to go for things anyway, despite the discomfort. And I'm finding that those are the moments where I have been seeing the most personal growth. Sometimes we just need enough conviction to take the next step. There have been plenty of moments in my life where I've talked myself out of things before I ever gave them a real chance. Not because I didn't care about them, but because I couldn't yet see what might exist on the other side of that uneasiness of trying something new. So if there's something that's been on your heart lately, something you've been considering creating or pursuing or stepping into, but you've been talking yourself out of it, maybe this is your reminder to give it a chance. Not because success is guaranteed, but because sometimes the only way to discover what something could become is to just start. So thanks again for being here. I've been sitting with that a lot lately, and I just wanted to share it because I'm genuinely grateful for each of you who continue to show up, to listen, reflect, and be part of these conversations. And in some ways, it actually ties directly into today's topic because today's conversation is really about the difference between what we mean and what actually gets experienced. Or another way of saying it is our intentions versus our impact. Because I think many of us want to believe that if our heart is in the right place, that's enough. And while I do think intentions matter, I've been realizing that good intentions don't always guarantee positive impact. Sometimes we mean one thing and we communicate another. And it's kind of that whole mean what you say and say what you mean idea. A lot of us don't always know how to clearly articulate what we're actually feeling. Sometimes we haven't fully processed it ourselves lately. Sometimes we don't completely understand what we're needing, wanting, or hoping for. And sometimes we just haven't found the words for it. But there are also those moments where, if we're really honest, we know exactly what we want to say, but we say something different anyway. Maybe we want to say no, but we say yes because it feels easier, because we don't want to disappoint someone. We don't want to create tension, or maybe we're worried about how they'll react because saying yes feels safer than having a difficult conversation. So while our intention might be to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, or to protect the relationship, what we may actually be communicating is agreement, availability, or capacity that we don't truly have. Then later, we're frustrated, overwhelmed, resentful, or exhausted, and the other person is confused because they're responding to what we communicated, not what we were feeling internally. So even when our intentions are genuine, our actions, reactions, tones, or words can end up communicating something entirely different than what we meant. And I think that's part of what makes relationships, communication, and even self-awareness a bit complicated. Sometimes we think we're helping when we're actually creating something we never intended. Sometimes we're trying to love people well, but what they experience feels different than what we meant. And sometimes, if we're really honest, there are layers underneath our behavior that we haven't fully recognized ourselves yet. And that's what I've been thinking about lately. That's what I want to explore together today. As I've reflected over the last couple years, I've noticed that sometimes what we think is driving our behavior isn't actually the full story. For a long time, I would have described myself as someone who just really loves helping people. And that's true. I do love helping people. I love seeing a need and stepping in. I love making someone's life easier. I love taking things off someone's plate. I love being able to say, I've got it, especially when it's someone I deeply care about. But somewhere along the way, I started realizing there was more happening underneath the surface, because helping wasn't just helping anymore. Helping had become tied to my sense of value. If I was useful, I felt needed. If I was needed, I felt important. If I was important, I felt secure. And if people appreciated what I was doing, it reinforced the idea that I mattered. That was a hard thing for me to admit, and it's something I'm still learning to navigate, because it would be easier if the story was simply, I just love helping. But growth often asks us to look beneath the story we've been telling ourselves, not because the original story was false, but because it wasn't complete. And I wonder how many of us have something like that, something we do that looks one way on the surface but has deeper roots underneath it. Maybe it's helping. Maybe it's overachieving. Maybe it's being the funny one. Maybe it's always being available. Maybe it's being the strong one who never asks for help. That behavior is real, but sometimes the motivation underneath it is more complicated than we realize. And I've noticed this showing up in other areas of my life too. One area where I've noticed it most is around projects and creative work. If it's something I've never done before, something I'm not fully confident in, or something that feels especially important to me, I have a tendency to procrastinate. And what's interesting is that if you asked me what my intention was, I'd tell you I wanted to get started early. I wanted to give myself plenty of time. I wanted to work on it in a calm, thoughtful way. I wanted to avoid the stress of rushing at the last minute, but somehow more often than I'd like to admit, I find myself staring down a deadline and wondering why I did this to myself again. For a long time, I told myself the story that I just needed to manage my time better. And while there may be some truth to that, I eventually realized that wasn't the whole story. Because when I got curious, what I found underneath wasn't laziness, it was fear. Fear that I wouldn't do it well. Fear that I would start and realize I wasn't capable of creating what I envisioned. Fear that the finished product wouldn't live up to the standard in my head. And what makes this especially interesting is that I have plenty of experiences that should probably make me trust myself a little more than I sometimes do. Over the years, people have come to me for all kinds of creative projects and ideas. I have experience in event design, balloon installations, graphics, t-shirts and other apparel, custom gifts. I do videography and photography and social media content. And many times those people, they'll ask me to do something I maybe never have actually done before, not because I've done that exact thing, but because I've done enough things in a similar space that they assume I can probably figure it out. And honestly, a lot of the time they are correct. There have been plenty of moments where my response has been, I haven't done that exact thing before, but I'm pretty sure I can figure it out. And usually I do, not perfectly, not without mistakes, not without learning along the way, but often better than I gave myself credit for in the beginning. And what's funny is that some of you listening have probably been those people. You've hired me, you've trusted me with your event, asked me to create something for you, or watched me execute something and thought I seemed completely confident. What you may not realize is that behind the scenes, especially when it's something new or something that matters a lot to me, there's usually a period where I'm second guessing myself. I'm thinking through every possible scenario, and I mean every possible scenario, wondering if I'm overlooking something, questioning whether I can actually pull off what's in my head. The closer it gets, the more aware I become of all the things that could go wrong. And then eventually the day comes. I show up, I start working, I solve the problems in front of me, and much of the time, everything turns out okay, which is what makes the whole thing a little ironic, because despite all the evidence that I can learn, adapt, and figure things out, I still find myself questioning my ability before I even started. And that's what made me realize that procrastination wasn't really the problem. It was the symptom. The deeper story is fear. And the more I started paying attention to that, the more I realized this wasn't just true procrastination. And it's true for a lot of our patterns, which reminds me of something a dear friend helped me realize recently. Every pattern teaches people something. The more consistently we show up in a certain way, the more people come to expect that version of us. If you always say yes, people learn that you'll probably say yes. If you always figure things out, people learn you'll probably figure things out. And if you always step in and rescue situations, people will come to expect that of you. And sometimes we become frustrated by expectations we unknowingly helped create. That's been a challenging realization for me, because there have been seasons where I overextend myself so often that people naturally came to see me as someone who could handle everything. And I liked to see myself as that too. The opposite felt very uncomfortable for me. It wasn't something I wanted to be my truth. And the truth is, I reinforced that image over and over again. Not because I wanted to deceive anyone or because I was trying to create unhealthy dynamics, but because I genuinely thought I was helping. The impact, however, was that people learned to expect a version of me that wasn't always sustainable. And eventually, when I needed boundaries, rest, or space, it felt confusing to people because it didn't match the version of me they had learned. This is where I think things get complicated because, again, intentions matter. Understanding someone's heart matters. Context matters. Humanity matters. But your impact matters too. And sometimes those things don't align. Good intentions and positive impact are not always the same thing. Someone can genuinely mean well and still create pain. A person can love others and still leave damage behind. Helping can cross into dependency. Protecting can create fear. Connecting can feel like pressure. Not because the intention was bad, but because humans are complicated. And the more I've reflected on that, the more I've realized that understanding our intentions is only part of the story. The other part is having the courage to pay attention to the impact we leave behind us. So some of the questions I've been asking myself lately is, what if the thing I'm frustrated about isn't actually the thing that's bothering me? What if the behavior is just the surface? What if there's a deeper story underneath it? Because I've noticed that whenever I slow down long enough to get curious, there's usually more there than I initially realized. Fear often looks like procrastination. People pleasing often looks like kindness. Control often looks like preparation. Overfunctioning often looks like generosity. And sometimes our biggest breakthroughs happen when we're willing to get curious instead of defensive. Not what's wrong with me, but what is this trying to tell me? What need am I trying to meet? What fear am I trying to avoid? What story am I still carrying? Now, I do think we have to be mindful and aware when we're having conversations like this, because it's easy to slip into becoming overly self-critical. We start noticing our patterns and suddenly everything feels wrong. But that's not the goal. The goal is not shame. The goal is awareness, because awareness gives us options. Awareness allows us to choose differently. Awareness creates room for growth. And I think growth often starts with curiosity. The willingness to ask, what am I not seeing? What might be true that I haven't considered yet? What impact am I having that I didn't intend? What story is living underneath this pattern? So maybe that's the question I want to leave you with today. What story might exist beneath the story you've been telling yourself? Where might there be a gap between what you mean and what gets experienced? And where might curiosity reveal something that defensiveness never could? Because growth doesn't come from having all the answers. You know, I'll be the first to tell you that I most certainly don't have them. In fact, a lot of what I share here are things I'm actively working through in real time. They're conversations I'm having in therapy, things I'm noticing in my relationships, patterns I'm becoming aware of, questions I'm still wrestling with, and maybe that's part of why these conversations matter to me. Not because I've arrived somewhere, but because I think there's value in being willing to slow down long enough to notice what's happening beneath the surface, to get curious, to reflect, to take ownership of the things that are ours to own, and to keep growing a little at a time. So if this conversation resonated with you, I'd encourage you to spend a little time with those questions this week. You might be surprised by what you discover. Thank you for spending this time with me. I so appreciate you being here. And as you're moving through your week, maybe pay attention to those moments where what you mean and what gets experienced don't perfectly align. Not so you can judge yourself, just so you can get curious, because that's often where growth begins. And at the end of the day, how you show up matters. Talk to you next week.